Hi everybody, welcome to the second of our lectures on I.D.B. Wells and her significance and what that tells us about America in this time period. So we just left off in the previous lecture, we're talking about what is the context? What is the context? How do you get an individual to feel comfortable enslaving a fellow human being? It's an important question. We talked about that quite a bit right at the tail end of the last lecture. Let's get more specific, because in the previous lecture, as you recall, I mentioned that there was a significant number of people in the ancient world who were given great respect, who did just that, who laid out a strong case. When I say strong, I don't mean good nor moral. I simply mean because of their brilliance and their prestige and their authority on issues of society and so forth, that there's great respect given to their opinions. And there's many people in the ancient world, but the ones I want you to focus on, the one you see there initially, which is Aristotle. And if you move up a little bit, you see the title of the slide there, Slavery, the Broad Human History of Exploitation of the Other. And then slavery in the American experience. So, and the question is, again, how do you get into bed at night and sleep on the labor of other human beings who are not free, cannot leave, and are entirely within your power? And frankly, you're not concerned with their well-being, how they are, their life goals, their plans, their relationships, their safety concerns, their growth, their human development, any of those, you're not concerned with that. Instead, you are using them in a very self-centered human way to make your life, as you perceive it, better in some kind of way. Usually, obviously, through a lot of labor. But obviously sexual exploitation could be there, or many other things too. So again, how do you justify this? Aristotle, who was one of the giants of the Greek world, as you guys know, and a brilliant mind. There's no question he's brilliant. But it's also a cautionary tale to show we have to be careful assigning brilliance, assigning that we could then dismiss any concerns from that brilliance. All right, let's pick up where I left off. So just for a second there, I paused it. I'm not sure why my little picture in the right-hand corner has frozen. Doesn't matter. You're fine without that. You don't have to see me. So we'll keep going. All right, so as mentioned, Aristotle, which was a giant in the Greek world, had given extensive justification for slavery. In a brief way, because we won't get into this deeply, but Aristotle simply said, people who are enslaved, the reason why they're enslaved is because their natural human nature has fitted them most properly for slavery. Translation, those who enslave others are not doing something unnatural. That people who have fallen into slavery, and he might mention some exceptions to this, but in general, people who are in slavery, there's a very good reason why. That's because they are inherently, naturally a slave people. That is their normal, natural condition. Just like an animal, a cow, or so forth. It's, in our contemporary world or in the past, see that, well, that's for labor, things you can do with the cow, produces milk, produces leather. That's just its natural nature. So Aristotle, in a similar way, says people who are enslaved, their natural condition is to be slaves. Because Aristotle's prominence, of course, not surprising this does, and gives considerable life intellectually as justification for enslaving other human beings. So we look at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, even the Islamic world, Aristotle is steadily quoted as perhaps the supreme justification for slavery being the natural order of things. In the modern world, we look at naturally as, of course, as a great horror, a tragedy, an immense abuse of human rights on a grand scale. But in the ancient world, although no one wanted to be a slave, of course, but to enslave another who you have conquered through warfare and so forth, that was considered a natural order of things in a harsh world in where your side has won and those you enslaved are naturally fitted for slavery. Thus, you can sleep well at night. You don't have to worry about no need to worry about the moral justification or the morality of it because you're simply following the natural order of things, just like gravity. Right? Now, The reason why this is significant is Aristotle will be quoted all the way up into the modern world as an authority on the subject. Now, it did get more complicated because from the Judeo-Christian heritage and Islamic world too, there was in all those three great Western thought systems a general idea of universal human value. So you have contradictions certainly in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam of taking a whole group of people and assigning them to this inferior status as slaves. But it does not mean in Judaism, Christianity, Islamic culture that there was an ideology at times too, that there was not an acceptance of slavery, because there was. But you also have that tension between the ideals of the faith system, which do promote universal human value. For example, that the monotheistic God in all three great systems sees the value in each individual human being, which, by the way, is contrary, of course, to Aristotle's view. But you also have people in Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview who use the religion in a very self-serving way, and frankly are not open to that universal perspective. Instead of they rummage through the holy books of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, looking to find some justification for slavery, and they would find some. And they ignore the broader moral perception of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which is strike hard against some of the core aspects of dehumanizing another human being, and then simply ignore that. Additionally, in the ancient world, you also have what's called colorism. Colorism is a preference for a skin color that looks like you. Whatever you're comfortable with is the norm. That's the normal, that's the standard. And so, in the ancient world, modern scholars would not use the term racism to describe these things in the ancient world per se, but they would certainly use colorism, because in the ancient world they would talk about people of a certain color and either liking that or disliking that strictly based on skin tone. The reason we don't call it racist is because race has more elements to it. For example, you are somehow your race genetically gives you certain qualities. In the ancient world, there'd probably be less of that kind of hard and fast perception. There'd just be a general, like, I don't like that color. Now, by the way, even in the ancient world, they have some, I'd say, prototype version of slavery. Of course, slavery. Prototype versions of racism that you and I would see today as a precursor to the modern understanding of racism. But they certainly had a full-blown colorism in where they prefer certain skin colors, of course, naturally preferring their own to others. All right, now, jumping in the context of where Ida B. Wells becomes prominent in the United States. So, the time period when she grows up, she was born a slave, but she was freed very early on in the Civil War. So she probably had no living memory of being a slave. But as a young girl, though, she is going to grow up during the transformative period known as Reconstruction. That's 1865 to 1877, as you guys know well from our lecture notes as well, too. Now, many scholars in more recent times, although there's been a lot of debate among scholars over how you'd even define this era, usually based on the era when you lived and to some degree in your racial understanding or biases. But in more recent time, I'd say the best American scholars often refer to this era of these 12 years as a second American Revolution. But other Americans despise this time period. So why is that? Now, this is a big topic, and we'll talk about this in other places too, but of course, Reconstruction is trying to put the nation together after the terrible trauma of the Civil War. Now, for many black Americans, it's a time of tremendous hope. Obviously freedom, because slavery is now unconstitutional, but there's an explosion of black education, black schools, and a hope that black Americans can now participate fully in American society through education, through work, politically. And to some degree, politically, it did happen. You had the enfranchisement of the vote extended to black men, and as long as they're protected by the Union Army throughout the South, they voted in very large numbers, which allowed a significant number of black Americans to serve at all levels of public office, from the local level all the way to the U.S. Congress. Now, while there's tremendous progress in some ways in the black community during these 12 years of Reconstruction, the white world in the South, many of them look on with a shock and stunned horror what they believe is this complete reversal of their whole racial perception of how society should function. Remember, for all these hundreds of years, you have made it cultural practices that the blacks, their natural condition is to be slaves. Now suddenly, they may be a representative, they may be a congressperson, they could be a person in the Senate, they could be a local judge, they vote in large numbers, become educated, and they're entering into parts of the society that you believe in them culturally to be and generally inferior. It's absolutely inappropriate for being in those places. So not surprisingly, many whites in the South, with their race views and cultural heritage, view Reconstruction as a nightmare. The world turned upside down for them. This is the context in which Ida B. Wells, as a young girl, begins going to school and becomes educated. And like that Black Revolution education, she plays a major, it plays a major role in her life, and she gets not a higher education, but a good lower elementary school education. I guess probably into high school a little bit in our modern context. And of course, her being a lifelong learner, even though her major formal education stopped what today we would really consider high school, frankly, she becomes quite well educated by the end of her formal education. I mentioned a backlash. Once Reconstruction ends and the Union armies withdraw from the South, you have throughout the South Jim Crow segregation implemented by Southern whites. Many of the strides made in the black community, especially politically, are rapidly withdrawn and eliminated. Black participation voting is going to spiral down rapidly to become almost non-existent by the year 1900. And this would be in place, Jim Crow segregation, as far as segregation racially throughout the South, from the end of Reconstruction, 1877, all the way into the 1950s, even in the 1960s in some ways. So this, again, is the environment in where now finished education, the young Ida B. Wells now begins to enter life. And early on as an educator, she's a teacher, and that is the kind of background for this uplift in the black community, but sadly on the other side, where the nation is at. If you guys are curious about Reconstruction, I have some books to recommend for you guys, which are excellent. The book on the left, Henry Louis Gates Jr., The Stony Road, Reconstruction and White Supremacy and the Rise of Jim Crow, is excellent. Jim Crow by C. Van Moore is also good. And if you want to try and track Jim Crow into the modern, much more modern world, Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackmun would be a good choice. Any of those would be a very good choice to give you an idea of what we're talking about with Jim Crow. And it's emerging out of Reconstruction and the rise of trying to reinforce in the South white supremacy by the white establishment. Now, as on Reconstruction, you have African Americans in large numbers trying to get educated, entering into professions they probably perhaps never could have before that, some of them even enter high levels of politics. So the white South, of course, many of them are horrified by this, and so in order to justify both their previous slavery, but also the current reintroduction of segregation, what is justification for that? And of course, it's not new, but they simply double down on what is already existing, which is the dehumanizing African Americans. And to also assert that because they are less human than us, the threat they pose is a grave threat. Now again, this goes back a long ways, really back to Aristotle and even earlier. But this colonial racial viewpoint is going to move past emancipation into Reconstruction, especially into Jim Crow. And you see there's two terms right here, so race science and scientific racism. Both these terms are, well, first of all, neither one is science. let's get that out of the way. But it is important to know that at that time, though, you would have quite well-respected scientists claiming, and I would say not in a certainly in a racist manner, but not in a racist manner that you and I today would say, I would hear that and you immediately know and dismiss it. In that time period, these highly respected scientists who would claim that we have scientific evidence to back up the alleged inferiority of Africans. And in this case, specifically African Americans, but Africans in general. They refer to that as race science or scientific racism, that they are genetically, not just but they are genetically incapable of being on an equal plane with white Americans. And they'd be more specific. They say, for example, African American men have greater uncontrollable sexual urges, as do black women. And so that causes the threat posed by black men, could be black women too, but they're focused primarily on black men, that threat means the chances of assault, rape, or so forth are very high. A whole series of books came out in this era on this theme. And for your notes, you don't need to know all these. I just want to give you a brief example of that. For example, the book there on the left, A Negro Beast or the Image of God. Because remember, in Judeo-Christian background, all people are considered God's people. And so all people would have been descended from Adam. If that's true, it gets much harder to, in your own mind, understand how could they be separate and less than. For example, if we all descend from Adam, then we all have the same core humanity and divine value in the eyes of God. Thus, as we Americans, how could we choose a different path? Well, you had a series of books come out in this time period during the post-Reconstruction that say, no, the answer is the Negro or the black person, the African, is not a genetic descendant of Adam. That they're a genetic, their branch, where it came from, is not the divine branch from Adam, that they are a subset or subspecies of humanity. Thus, for example, we'll get really practical. The golden rule, do unto those you have done to you, does not apply to them because they're not like me. Again, think in the category of some version of a higher order animal in which you would not have to practice the golden rule. Thus, you can see why Jim Crow segregation makes, in this a twisted mentality, makes logical sense because they're fundamentally not like you and me. And with that, that's the end of this lecture. We'll get to the next one. We'll get to Abby Wells, what she does. But we'll stop right here.